has survived into our present day as literary journalism. That these are the works that journalists see as valid literary journalism. And this is what I'm working on as I'm exploring the work of these two writers. One of them is Tony Lukas. He's the guy in the middle there. That's him at one of the More conferences. You can see the square bracket around the word More on the banner behind him. And then on the right, his friend and Harvard classmate, David Halberstam. And I'm setting them up a little bit in opposition to a third refugee from the New York Times, Gay Talese, who is squarely in that group of the new journalists, and who I would argue is a little bit outside of the mainstream of the sort of elite journalism that the other two are practicing. Talese was a very good reporter, despite some of his more recent ethical issues and possibly lack of questioning some of the sources on his motel sex voyeurism book. He was known for being a very good reporter, particularly early. You know, Frank Sinatra Has a Cold is still a story that I give to students to teach them how to report as much as how to write when a source isn't talking to you. But his journalism is different in a way that I haven't quite gotten my hands around yet. So Lukas and Halberstam, they knew each other at Harvard. They were partners on the Harvard Crimson. One, and I forget who was who. One was the editor, one was the managing editor, but they were 1 and 2 at the Crimson. And in my dissertation and book research, I came across this in the New York Public Library archives. This was, I couldn't take a photograph because the archives didn't allow it at the time, although they now do. I wish I had the photograph. This is a hastily typewritten letter of recommendation that Halberstam gave to the staff of the New York Times to bring his friend Tony Lukas over from the Baltimore Sun. And I think it shows a little bit of some of the things that I've heard about Halberstam in my reporting. I've talked to a few of his editors who said that he was a first-rate reporter, but a terrible writer. That his prose was sloppy. There were run-on sentences. And if you read some of his works now, you'll see this in a couple of the excerpts. In the finished versions, there are horrible comma splices that I would edit out of my student papers immediately. He was not a prose stylist, and yet his books are long narratives that weave together strands that are very complicated, that tell a bigger story. This is fun, but I have to move on, so probably too much to read. So I'm trying to define a genre that I'm temporarily calling big important books. And this is a photograph of one Lukas book and one Halberstam book sitting on my admittedly very small desk at home, but these are hefty tomes that, were I checking a bag, I might have brought along, but these were not being carried onto an airplane. These are 600, 700, 800 page books. Some of them took 6, 7, 8 years to write at a time. There was a huge amount of reporting that went into them. And I try to grasp toward an idea of what a big important book was by the end of this. These are the bibliographies of Halberstam and Lukas. Lukas on the left, Halberstam on the right. I've omitted Halberstam's sports books just for the purposes of this, but in total, Halberstam published 21 books, including one posthumous book. But these are the books that I would say sort of establish this idea of what the big important book is. So for Tony Lukas, the one that gets mentioned most often is Common Ground, his 1986 story of the busing crisis in Boston, which weaves together the stories of several families across greater Boston when they were doing forced integration of the schools at the time. Halberstam has almost too many to mention, but certainly The Best and the Brightest, The Powers That Be. These are books that talk about either recent history or social ideas, and do so in a narrative style. This is a more recent citation. This was spoken yesterday. But a lot of what gives the power to these books is the specificity of the reporting. Right? This is something I learned when I was in journalism school. Was you can't cover up for an underreported piece by being a good writer. And when I went into journalism school, I went in because I wanted to be a writer and realized very quickly that all of the work of journalism is in the reporting, in the fact gathering. And one of the purposes of this study, I think, is to sort of return the primacy of that research method into the study of literary journalism. This is a couple of quotations from the reporter Clyde Haberman, not Halberstam, this is Haberman. His obituary of Tony Lucas when Lucas killed himself shortly after the publication, or actually shortly before the publication of his final book. It was actually within a week or two after he submitted it to the publisher. But you can see that Haberman is focusing on Lucas as a reporter. It is on his fact gathering, it is on the way that he focuses on taking in information, doggedly pursuing people. Both Halberstam and Lucas were known for, as somebody referred to it yesterday, farming for the right source, looking for the right story that was going to be able to tell the bigger story that they wanted to tell. So if Lucas went into a story on, say, the bus boycott, the busing crisis in Boston, he knew that that was the larger story, but that what he really wanted to get to were the specifics. You can see that a lot of the prose of Halberstam and Lucas is not all that different from the prose of many of the other literary journalists. So this is the first paragraph of Common Ground. It is a thick description of a place, introducing a character. The same can be true of Halberstam. This is actually a piece that was published in the Washington Post last week, giving me the news peg for this study, saying that Halberstam had more or less been forgotten in the canon of journalists. I find that slightly hard to believe. It seems like the wrong thesis, though anything that is bolstering Halberstam's reputation is still pretty good. And again, in Edger's piece, he is saying the same sorts of things about the reporting that goes into these books. I'll skip past these. The Best and the Brightest and Powers That Be have surprisingly similar introductions. They are both sort of oblique references to John F. Kennedy. But again, it's that same sort of style that you find in much literary journalism. So this is trying to get toward a definition of this idea of the big important book. I think that this is the kind of study where the reporting is valued over the writing. Writing is important. The narratives are strong and they support the book, but they're about social and cultural issues, and the reporting is the most important thing. They're generally not written by academics. They're written by people who see themselves as journalists and want to maintain a membership in the fraternity of professional journalists. These broader ideas, I would say, are grounded in stories of individuals and are often narrative. They want to be a part of the conversation. Whatever the nation is talking about, they want to influence that conversation in some way. And I define this, for those in the US, as the book that's going to get you interviewed on Fresh Air, right? It's the book that's going to get you an NPR radio interview. And these are some of the things that I would propose are current examples of this idea of the big, important book. But in short, I would say it's the book that other professional journalists respect. It is literary journalism within those norms of professional journalism. And there's sort of a policing of norms. This is where you get into the writers who are very defensive about the reporting that they put into them. The Buzz Bissinger statement about how nothing was recreated. Everything came from, that would be my own alarm, everything that came from reporting from journalists. It's the literary journalism of journalists, not the literary journalism of writers. And that's sort of the idea that I'm trying to define, and I welcome the input of anybody who knows more about this than I do. So, thank you.
Hi, I am the comic guy, and what I'm going to present here is a chapter of my thesis on the aesthetics of comic reportage. I need to skip the theory slides because of the time, but I just say that I'm investigating the influence of journalistic, of technology and objects in journalism, the journalism practice. And I bring some examples, and I use the actor network theory in order to go to the subject. This is like the ground of my research, and yeah, I want to understand the influence of journalistic objects in the practice, in the all-day practice of journalism. Until I come here, this is the main topic, then I go directly to there. This is Melton Pryor. He was a reporter of the Illustrated London News, and he covered the Crimean War in the 19th century on the spot. This is a drawing showing him drawing on the spot, and his drawings were sent to the newsroom in London, where other artists finished the drawings. So I work with comic journalism. Comic journalism is considered like the new journalism, and we could think that this idea of this sketchbook is new in journalism, but actually it had its presence in the history of journalism. And what I want to understand is how these modern comic reporters use this tool, and how this sketchbook influenced the practice. Here is a picture of an exhibition of U.S.A. works method. I don't know if you know U.S.A. is the most famous comic journalist, and there was an exhibition of his work last year in Basel at the Cartoon Museum, and he doesn't draw on the spot. He made pictures, and these pictures help him to draw the atmosphere later when he's making the comic. And he works more like Gaitalis. He doesn't take notice. He just listens to the interviews, and at the end of the day, he writes a report for himself. And sometimes he makes drawings because this is the ability of comic journalists of making visual questions. But for example, in some cases like this, in this case, he brought the drawings and he asked people to tell where they were in a specific building, in a specific event. This is of the book Gaza. So this is his practice of comic journalism. But some artists are telling that drawing on the spot helps to make interviews. This French artist, Hippolyte, he tells that when he sits and draws, people come to him and ask, what are you doing? They ask him to be drawn, and it's not seldom that he's invited to come home with these people and to meet someone else, and this is like a door to closed communities if you go there. And this artist, for example, from Switzerland, he was just, this reportage he was just sitting there in Lucerne near the train station, and people come to him and he tells the story of these people. And another example is Victoria Lomasco. She's from Russia, and she was covering a LGBT film festival when skinheads came by, and she tells that if she were making pictures, she would be beaten, but she was drawing, and they waited to see how they would be drawn by her. This is interesting. I think I have some ideas about that. Why drawing helps to make these interviews? I think that that has something to do with fascination of drawings, because it's interesting that you see how someone draws ourselves. It's like an interpretation and harder, stronger than photography. That's the first impression. And these artists tell that artists have more access to place where journalists can't go. This is a photograph, a picture of a Brazilian photograph. His name is Meuret. He lives in favelas in Rio de Janeiro. He makes this picture playing with stereotypes of slums in Brazil. But I use this picture to demonstrate this difference between drawing and making pictures. Because when you use a camera, actually it is like a weapon. And sometimes it's something that's between interviewer and interviewed, and sometimes it's aggressive. It's in your privacy. When you are drawing, you can put the sketchbook on your legs. And you can, because you need to draw the person, you look at the person, and that helps to make interviews. Because if you were interviewed, it's not nice when the interviewers always take notice while the interview happens. This is some things I think about, and I try to organize 3 situations nowadays, where pictures have advantage, drawings have advantage in comparison with photographs. Because in the very beginning of journalism, there was photograph, but it was not possible to print it in the newspapers. That's why Milton Pryor or other reporters of the Illustrated London News were drawing. And drawing was possible by drawing to capture dynamic scenes like these battles in the war. But nowadays, photography is better. You can make this pretty much better with photographs. But anyway, there are situations nowadays where we can think about the advantage of drawing. And I bring some examples. This is where photographs are not allowed. Maybe you know this case. Guy Delis, he was in North Korea. I know some photographs on North Korea, but it's not usual. And the other is Japanese, and he works in Fukushima cleaning the reactors. He's not working undercover because he's not a journalist. He's really working to get money. But this is an advantage of artists, that they can go there, they don't need to draw on the spot, but they have a visual memory, and they can draw at the end of the day and tell this experience where journalists don't have access, or it's difficult. The Japanese, it's only his publisher know who he is. And this is not journalism, it's just an example of a Berlin artist, and he was in this fetish clubs in Berlin, and of course he couldn't take pictures, but when he draw, it's another case because he kind of takes part in the event. It's like a voyeur. And this case maybe is an example of other case. How does it work? And when it's not possible, for example, when it's something happened in the past, this artist, he was in Paris during the attacks, and he was in Bataclan, and of course he couldn't take pictures, but he can draw what he saw and tell a very authentic story about that. In this case, it's also kind of therapeutic, because he needs to do with that. But in the case of Igor, he was in Russia, in Ukraine, he helps to tell the story of people who survived the Holodomor, the hunger program in the 1930s. And then the last case is, for example, it's a reportage that is about prostitution network, and most of the interviews were under 18, and even if they were over 18, it would be very radical to show them and to expose them, and then drawings helps to protect the identity of people. So,
Thank you. Mateus, Yuri, Passos. The floor is yours.
Okay. My just for some just some connection from Pelican has crashed here. Okay. Sorry about that. So just some contextual information. I'm doing my postdoctoral research on Joseph Mitchell and on the development and the maturing of his style from his earlier days in some New Yorker newspapers, with his earlier days and on his work in the New Yorker, and then his late works, Jagged Secrets, and the pieces I'm going to talk about today. 3 fragments of a memoir book he started writing in the late 1960s, and he didn't finish. Actually, the book never really take off. Okay, this is I'm going to read part of my work and present some things. Joseph Mitchell is acknowledged not only for the quality of his work, but also for the writer's block he suffered, starting with the publication, or after the publication of Jagged Secrets in 1964. However, between 2013 and 2015, the New Yorker has published 3 fragments of his unfinished memoir book, fragments that were written between, just like I just said, late 60s and mid 80s. They are titled Street Life, Days in the Branch, and The Place of Pasts. The 3 pieces reveal a very different Mitchell in comparison to the author of Professor Siegel and Machado's Wonderful Saloon, for example. These new pieces focus on Mitchell himself, reminiscences, and obsessions. This shift to a more personal voice and style is also noticeable in his writing from the 1950s onward, comprising 4 of the stories collected in The Bottom of the Harbor, and in the profile essay or essay profile Jagged Secret. And it also coincides with the phase that's labeled by Noel Perrin as Mitchell's elegiac period, in which his obsession with the remnants of New York's past becomes the focal point of his pieces. So this is what I'm going to focus on. There was a paper published in 1983 by Noel Perrin, which was very helpful for my research because he proposes an organization of Mitchell's works in 3 phases, with a focus on the subjects of the pieces. That's his main criteria for labeling and structuring these phases, and also the treatment Mitchell applies to such subjects. So there is an earlier phase, which is comprised mostly his newspaper stories and his earlier New Yorker pieces. Actually, I didn't put the dates actually, but it's around 1929 to 1938, and most of this work is collected in this in his first book, My Years Are Bent. Then there is a middle phase from 1938 to 1947, and these works are published. Most of these works are published in Machado's Wonderful Saloon and Old Mr. Flood, which is now considered to be a fiction work, but it actually his main character is a composite based on several interviews he did with people from the Fish market. And the last phase in Perrin's view is his, what he calls the elegiacal phase from 1947 to 1964. Actually, two of the pieces in the bottom of the harbor are more similar to his middle phase, the Riverman and Rats on the Waterfront. So I myself would consider them to be part of the middle phase, and then we will have 4 pieces in the bottom of the harbor, which would make this elegiacal phase. And what I am proposing here, actually, I have just published a paper in Brazil. It's translated into English. It's a bilingual paper, where I am proposing that there is a 4th phase, and that's what I'm going to propose here. I'm going to skip some, and then I'll be back. This 4th phase consists of Jagged Secrets, so it wouldn't be part of the elegiacal phase, but of a further development in Mitchell's work, and these 3 fragments of his memoir book, which were published. We don't know the exact dates. Michael Hunkel's biography of Mitchell has established that the first piece, Street Life, started to be developed in the late 1960s. And in the 3rd fragment, Place of Bats, Mitchell says that he was he started writing these pieces 20 years before that piece was written. So there is at least a period of 20 years of intermittent writing, scarce writing actually. And the most distinct elements of this 4th phase would be the development of an inner voice. It was already present in some pieces of the bottom of the harbor, where he starts his profiles and reportage talking about himself and his habits, the start of his depression. But he's still talking about his present. He's interviewing people, he's talking about contemporary experiences in those pieces. And in this, in Jagged Secrets and in the 3 fragments of his memoir book, he shifts from the present to the past. He stops interviewing and observing contemporary events, and he starts to reminiscent, to remember events that happened to him, that happened to other people. He heard about them. And aside Perrin, David Eason's chapter in one of Sim's book, one of the books that Norman Sim has edited, Literature and the Image World. He establishes 2 categories for new journalists, realist new journalists and modernist new journalists, which would mostly, in a quick summary, they would be like, in the first case, people who try to depict reality as it is, and in opposition to that, people who, like John Didion and Hunter Thompson, for example, who try to interpret reality, and they make it clear that all of their pieces are interpretations and are mediated by their own perceptions. And this is what Jagged Secret is about, actually, and this fragments. So I'm going to read 2 excerpts from A Place of Pasts that help us to shed some light on this aspect. This is from the beginning of the piece. In the fall 1968, without at first realizing what was happening to me, I began living in the past. These days, when I reflect on this and add up the years that have gone by, I can hardly believe it. I have been living in the past for over 20 years, living mostly in the past, I should say, or living in the past as much as possible. And I should also say that when I say the past, I mean a number of pasts, a hodgepodge of pasts, a spider's web of pasts, jungle of pasts. My own past, my father's past, my mother's past, the past of my brothers and sisters, the best of a small farming town geographically misnamed Fairmont, down in the citrus farms and blackened bottoms and wildflower magnolia bays of southeastern North Carolina. A town in which I grew up and from which I fled as soon as I could, but which I go back to as often as I can, and have for years, and for each even at this late date, I am now and then, all of a sudden, and for no conscious reason at all, heart-wrenchingly homesick. The best of several furnished room houses and side street hotels in New York City, in which I lived during the early years of the Depression, when I was first discovering the city, and I disappeared one by one, without a trace, a long time ago, but that evidently made a deep impression on me. And okay, so I can't really summarize the four pieces at this moment. But my point here is that his recollections are also journalistic, because he's not only interested in his own life, on the events that affected him as an individual, but of events that have some meaning to his depiction of New York, to his depiction of Fairmont, of Robeson County, the place where he grew up. And it would read, I know, it's really sad that he couldn't finish it, because if finished, this book would show us a very different writer from the one who started working in the New Yorker in the late 1930s, and maybe a very different path on how to do different journalism. That's it for now.
Okay, thank you very much. So I turn to the audience now. Any questions? We have plenty of time for discussion.
Question for Mateus. So you were saying that he was Mitchell felt like he was living in the past, living in many pasts. So would they be the past at the cost of his own consciousness, you mean, in terms of was he obliterating his own consciousness in a way? So like, is he kind of like a somnambulist through life at this point, or?
Yeah, actually, he experienced a deep depression during the 60s. Actually, maybe this was what motivated him to write Jagged Secrets. He was already feeling depressed. And I think somnambulist would be a good adjective for him in this moment. And it seems like the writing of this memoir was an attempt to cope with this state of mind. He actually says it in the first one, Street Life. He ends the piece by saying, okay, this is the story of how I became depressed and how I moved out of depression. Actually, he never told us how he did that. But what seems most interesting to me is that his main interest is this collective past, like the past of the people he has interviewed, who made it to some of his stories in the New Yorker, stories that weren't published, the stories of the people from Robeson County who maybe had lived 200 years before he was even born, and he has done some research on them. But yeah, this kind of writing demands a different state of consciousness in order to suppose. Yes. I'm not sure if that was the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to respond to Karen's request.
Oh, well, thank you.
I think you've opened a really interesting door, and you've taken a couple steps in, and where to go from there is the big question. I have a number of suggestions, all together, cherry pick. whatever seems right to you. And they come in three sort of areas. The first would be for the big book. Each big book has something like a reputational arc. And sometimes the arc is very flat and goes for a long time. Sometimes it flashes and goes away. I think you might, in that area, think about sales over time. Think about the critical reception. I remember The Best and the Brightest got a lot of great reviews at the time it was published, and then there were sort of reconsiderations later saying these are cardboard characters he's drawn, you know, and he was all blah blah blah. So there's a critical reception over time. Is it still in print? That's always a question. And then this might be easier than you think, but is it still used in writing courses? Does the Academy think you have merit? The second area is a little odder, a little harder to do, but I think you ought to consider not just the splash the stone made when it hit the pond, but I guess this would be in the realm of media effects. Can you find any evidence, or lack thereof, that each of these three big books or others really effectuated social change, social and cultural change? What did we learn from it? Now that's kind of hard to document. You know, it can be, you know, legislation is easy, but there are all kinds of other social results, social changes that aren't so easy to document. But something, what's the long term? And then my last one, I think the last category would be biographical. And this would be going into the character of your individuals and asking yourself, real interesting question is, why did they write this book? What were their aspirations? What were they trying to do? And then secondly and lastly, sort of another version of the media effects thing is, how were they affected by the book? You know, did they make a lot of money? Did they dine out on it for a long time afterwards? One of the things that Halberstam used to love to talk about himself was, you know, I do the shoe leather thing. You know, he was very proud of being a reporter, but he was also a real bon vivant. In many meanings of that word. And so we kind of identified with sort of a working class, you know, I'm the gutsy guy that's going to dig through the trenches and get you the truth. And at the same time, he really enjoyed many aspects of the good life.
Sure. Lukas, on the other hand, was very much a depressive and dealt with clinical depression for much of his life, I think, probably in ways that were similar to Joseph Mitchell. And eventually ending with suicide or right before the publication of his last book. You know, I wonder too about the idea of like collective memory and how these books enter into collective memory, because I think a lot of what we remember about busing in Boston is this book, is Common Ground, or what we remember about some of the Vietnam War is From the Best and the Brightest, whether it was accurate or not, or fully rounded characters or not. I think that these books probably do have some sort of collective memory influence that might be interesting in investigating when we're looking at that long tail.
I guess I have a different set of suggestions that those to think about.
Sure, reviewer number 2. Yeah, sorry.
One is a couple of books they added that. Neil Sheehan's Bright Shining Light about Vietnam, and more recently, Ken Auletta, Three Blind Mice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I would probably frame this less in terms of the reporting and more in terms of the question. These are authors that are asking larger questions. It's very much like documentary journalism, where instead of reporting the news today, you're trying to ask, what is the impact of smoking on the culture or something like this, or in the case of these writers, how was the 50s a revolutionary time, even though people didn't think it was, and you have the appearance of Holiday Inn and the whole idea of motor transportation and civil rights and blacks that weren't allowed to go to these same places. And so it's a big social question. The same is true with best and the brightest. If you have the best possible people, how do we get into this mess in Vietnam? And I think that that probably holds, especially with Ken Letter. How was it that the networks all got purchased during the 1980s? That the powers that be is really revolutionary in the, it's about 76, 79?
79, yeah.
And that is like just before the bottom fell out of big media corporations and everything changed in the Reagan era. So it was really timely to ask that question. So it's a journalist's question, but it's from much further out. And I think that's part of why they do so much additional reporting is because they're asking big questions.
Right.
And another thing I really wondered about, I was trying to place the timing. I'm not sure when electronic typesetting became part of the publishing business. Like word processing was early, mid-80s, but in the publishing business, at some point they switched over to electronic typesetting. So that means it's a lot easier to publish a big book like that than it would have been, and more cost-effective than it would have been. So I think there's at least an economic history question here in terms of publishing.
That was 72.
For electronic publishing, for typesetting.
Yeah.
And the third point was not questions, and it was not typesetting. The third point was, if I think of it, I'll raise my hand.
Yeah, well, I know if nothing else, the electric typewriter influenced that Halberstam letter, which allowed him to have a much larger output, but it also, clearly, all of the repeated A's that are in there are intentional on my point. He obviously had a loose A key when he was typing that up.
So I did recall. So the third thing, I don't know whether this is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but in terms of, you know, in an organization like this where you're trying to define and elaborate on what is literary journalism, you get to the point where it's not about the medium. You know, you're talking about books, and a lot of people today have been talking about magazines, and I look at television documentary or documentary film. So literary journalism is not about the medium, it's about something else. So if it's about something else, how does it show up in these books, these big important books, in ways that other kinds of books don't? So if somebody's writing a history of, they become more a chronicle. But journalists tend to ask questions. So I think that idea of, you know, asking the big questions it kind of gets at something that's a little bit unique to that form.
I could underscore that. Just think about Beth and Dwight as just one example. You know, what's the big question under there, which must have been Halberstam's starting point, and that was, you know, if all these people are so wonderful, we've been told they're wonderful, how could they, you know, and it all ends up like a big tragedy. Was it hubris?
Right.
You know, here the people were told they're wonderful, here's how they are responsible for terrible, terrible things. How did that happen? What does that say about us? What does it say about human nature? You know, and all that reporting that you so eloquently described was just kind of digging up the facts that would support, you know, you could write the stupidest and the dumbest and tell the same story, but with a different central question.
And one last point on this, that if you take something like All the President's Men, that again is pretty much a chronicle. It's a big, or not big, but it's an important book, but much more of a reporting of here's what we did. And even Leon Jaworski's Breach of Faith, I think about, he's been on my mind after this firing of Comey, but Jaworski was the special prosecutor of Nixon. But that was more of almost a memoir of this time period. So you can get into books, but then you can separate out certain kinds of journalistic books. And it just seemed to me that what you're talking about there is sort of big picture journalism.
Yeah, I think that idea of the questions that they're asking makes a lot of sense, and that they are journalists' questions. I think that's a good way of thinking about what this is.
And they, maybe they had him in on promotion because they were journalists. Halberstam and Sheehan, they kind of got the chops reporting on the war, and then they decided, all right, I want to do something bigger, and they're already, at a major news organization. So they can get an agent and, and get that big chunky book through the system. It's really interesting.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for all the papers. I've got a question from Mateus, and we go for getting on. So I haven't got one for you, but I did think it was really interesting the way you showed things about cartoons and about comics, which I hadn't even thought about in terms of access to stuff and so on and so on. But my area is much more aligned with Kevin's. And just to add to the points that David and Tom have made, which are really helpful for you, you can track, I've done this, so I'm happy to show you where I've done it. The number of what you are calling big important books, that I would just call book and journalism, to use a kind of more broad title, that have won the Pulitzer Prize for General Non-Fiction, the Pulitzer Prize for General Non-Fiction began in, I think, 1962, and I did a count, I can show you where it is, of what begins as a category that tends to be won by academic historians or professional historians, if you like, or just general book writers, becomes increasingly a category that's won by journalists. And there's a kind of a parallel economic history question, which is to do with, as you're alluding to, who are the people that are in place to do these stories? They're people who've done the reporting on the ground initially. Halberstam's a New York Times reporter, as you say. Sheehan's a New York Times reporter. Lukas is a New York Times. Most of these people, and the same applies in Australia, where I look at it as well, they do the daily reporting on the issues, and that's the start of the research time. It buys you research time.
Right.
And then they have the contacts, they move from there, and so they can produce this book. But they're kind of 2/3 around track compared to the rest of us who might not have covered it at all in the first place. So there's that element. And another one which David kind of alluded to, and I agree with him, and it's difficult to get to, but these books do enter the kind of the popular culture and the popular discourse, and how you track that is difficult, but I think it would be really interesting if you could, because I think they do live for many years in many ways, and we can see them easily when they enter the vernacular, the best and the brightest, the right stuff, etc., those things. But they're the sort of, and this is a real subterranean thing, but journalists read these books and then they recycle them in their articles.
Right.
They never attribute them, or rarely, but they enter the journalistic kind of collective mind memory, and the wisdom that is in that book, which is broader and more expansive than the material you get from the daily report, just gets recycled back into the, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's a good thing, I wish they'd attribute all, but it's a good thing. And it's harder to track, but that most definitely happens in my view, and if you could find a way to track that with some of these big books, you would have a really powerful way of seeing their subtler but more far-reaching impact on the culture. So that was a couple of thoughts, and I'm really happy to have a chat to you afterwards if you would find that helpful. And Mateus, the thing I was going to ask you about was, you mentioned the biography, the recent biography of Joseph Mitchell by Thomas Kunkel. I think there's Jill Lepore from the New Yorker, she's a historian, but she writes for the New Yorker, has also produced a book in the last year or so called something like Jagged Secrets or something like that.
Jogle's Teeth.
That's the one, yeah. I don't know if you've looked at that.
Yes.
You have? Okay, well here's my question then. What in terms of the questions you're asking about Joseph Mitchell and that kind of big silence at the end of his career, what do you make of their two kind of, what they've gathered and collected on those questions in Kunkel's biography and Lepore's, because I haven't read the whole, both of them, but they seem to be going into slightly different places. I'm just wondering what your assessment of what they have found is.
Yeah, actually, this piece, Jagged Teeth, is more focused on the person himself, and his attempt to to write this huge scope oral history. And the point is that there were some chapters that were found like very recently of this oral history project that Richard didn't have access to. He firmly believes that the oral history was consisted of dozens of versions of two specific chapters, an essay chapter and a memoir chapter. But they found that there's some more to it. That's basically, I mean, Good was not really a hoax, a fraud. He was trying to do something, but his main obstacle was himself. He was hindering himself from doing this work, really developing this project. So I don't think it sheds some light on Mitchell's work, by itself, but on it's a complement. I think it's like a third book in this sequence of Professor Siegel, Jagged Secrets, Jagged because it's a bit useful for us as to reconstruct the past and to have access to some information that Mitchell didn't have.
Okay.
It helps us in order helps us to understand Good more than Mitchell's work. But it's actually is a great piece.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have a curiosity. Do you want me to do it like we do in Brazil for the sake of the learning transnational literary journalism? We would start like, Augusto, it's not really a question, it's more like an invitation for us to think together. And your talk just, I start thinking about, because we had some panels on how to teach storyboards and teach literary journalism. And then you are offering there a kind of a new tool that journalists and as teachers usually do not use. So, and it seems that makes sense because sometimes we really cannot, even in a conference, sometimes we feel a little bit embarrassed to take a pic, isn't it, with our iPhones. So, considering this argument is okay, how would you suggest to include in the teaching of journalism drawing? Is it possible?
It's necessary to draw. Me, for example, I can't draw, but I work with artists. I'm not saying that people need to draw, I'm just trying to understand in which situations drawing can be the best option, or what has been changed with the practice of comic journalism. But actually, I'm very interested in the matter of the journalistic tools. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think we don't think too much about that, how really we can get other content in interview if you use a recorder or if you really take notes. And this is actually the basis of the research, and I just use the sketchbook to think about these things. The influence of journalism was made with typewriters, or the telegraph, being this structure of the inverted pyramid, and the new technologies now with social networks or smartphones. This always changed the way we practice journalism and the way we consume journalism. And I think just think with the sketchbook is only the top of the iceberg for me in this research. But actually my thesis is on aesthetic, because I think a lot of people are enthusiastic interested about comic journalism, comic reportage, but I don't think that the question of quality is there inside. And people just think that it's nice to make journalism with comics. And I try to investigate actually how can we use the medium for that. And this is actually like thinking how can we use literature for journalism, literary journalism.
When you're talking about using journalistic tools, you may not know the answer to this, or if anybody knows. Are there any journalists whose final medium is language who use sketching as a note-taking tool? You know, is there a history of anybody who is doing an interview and sketches the interview subject?
Well, I was just thinking that Tom Wolfe comes to mind because he did a lot of sketching as well as obviously a lot of writing. And so there was a period, I think it was when he was at the Washington Post, I think it's in the Washington Post very early in his career, where he was given a weekly page, and he had both a story and a sketch running alongside each other. So he was kind of doing both that way.
And I think particularly for reporters who are doing a lot of description, if they're drawing a scene or taking notes that way rather than writing it down.
In Lucerne, at the College of Arts, they are teaching artists to make reportage. And this idea of visual state that comes from Robert Libre, the artists go outside and they try to portray the reality.
If you want, if you wanted a fictional tie-in, in Moby Dick, there's a chapter called "A Bower in Our Cicades," where Ishmael etches the whale bones into his skin, and he says, "Too bad I don't have more room. I cover my entire body, right, with all of this." And it seems to me that there's a connection here to narrative, right? That's closer to a reporting question than a narrative question that you're asking. So in other words, it's how do I take that experience with me? How do I etch it into my body, as it were? How do I etch it into my memory enough so that I can then reproduce it onto the page, right? So I think that's a retrieval and a preservation of an event that you're trying to go for. Obviously, a circumventing medium, right? That's not a new invention, a new gadget, but something that's going backward, right, in retrieving an old medium. And I'm thinking of McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan, of course, and I'm thinking of Bill Kovarik, who's done some environmental. You might want to look him up. Revolutions in Communication is the name of his book. He's done some great theory on this too. So I think what would be great for your project is to look at that method of reportage, right? Of capturing the event and sketching it out, and then conjoining it with the word-image association in terms of narratology and narrativity, right? So, in other words, there's a lot that's been done with digital narrative, right? And the word-image association and trying to make sense out of embedded multimedia add-ons. What you have now, though, is a fascinating twist backward off the digital to almost like a primal medium of storytelling. I mean, I'm going to cave paintings now. It fascinated me so much, right? But that's the original narrative that human history has, right? Is that sketch of a memory on, right? And it to me, though, once we juxtapose it, we intersperse it with the written word, and yes, if it's a reporting tool like Tom Wolfe or something, now you're bridging, you're conjoining it in a totally brilliant way, reporting and writing, right? And you're getting absolutely to the heart of it. And I'm thinking, yeah, you're right to go into graphic arts medium because there's Mouse, there's Persepolis, there's this graphic arts novel tradition that is drawing on memory. Yeah, okay, so Mouse may be fictionalized, but it's not. It's drawing on real Holocaust memory, right? And so, where is the word image kind of juxtaposition, association working out a totally new way of telling stories, right? In terms of narrativity. So I think reporting, narrativity, you're onto something really great. So.
I like to think this distinction that Luhan makes between the post-literacy woman,
Yes.
the pre-literacy, and the literacy woman. And that at the very beginning, the Middle Age, for example, I forgot the name of this figure in English, but there was people coming from city to city, and they were singing the news and dancing the news.
Yeah.
And I forgot that.
Exactly.
And then we had this age of newspaper, and we see in journalists this crisis of journalists or press journalists. And then come these people now making comic journalism, even more people making online hypertext journalism or interactive project. And I try to associate it with this idea of the new human, this idea that we are actually multimedia right now.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing about drawing, in the very beginning, so drawing was the best way to draw the battles. But right now, for example, there is this genre of drawing protest. And artists go to protest and they draw them. And if you think in taking pictures, it's always a manipulation in protest because it's 1 second, 1 moment, and it shows really other things. But if you draw, if you have a good intention,
Right.
you can condense the scene in one drawing.
Okay, so I add one more thing to this, and you can do whatever you want with it, but it would be neat to see it work into your project somehow. So in New York, there are some extraordinarily wealthy families, okay, who have decided to ban all photography, all smartphones at weddings, okay, and instead hire a painter just to put up an easel. And the New York Times covered this, so you can find the full article. A painter to put up an easel and paint one of the scenes, whether it's the reception, whether it's the actual wedding, you name it, right? But instead of having, thousands of photographs that, Uncle Harry and Aunt Joan are going to, put out there in public before the event's even over, right? And profane it that way, they're going to have one sacred image. And it's going to be on canvas and oil, okay? And so these paintings go for extraordinary amounts of money. But the idea is that they're commissioned, usually they're hand-picked painters, etc. I think that's exactly where you're going, though, to remember that moment, right, through that medium, as opposed to this one. Something to just remember, yeah.
Just a last comment. I also try to connect this new movement of comic journalism with this idea of drawing poverty, also journalism, social movement. If you think Gustavo has a book about the periphery in London, in the 19th century, or there is this book in New York about tenements in New York. It's a very famous book with text and photographs and.
Is that how the other lives?
Yeah, for example.
Marist or Rust, yeah.
And there was this tradition, then came photographs and came the way we think what is reality, and then, maybe we can bring it back.
For Augusto to continue this, I found it very interesting how you selected the visuals to show, for example, a photograph of somebody with a camera flanked by people with rifles and the idea of it being a weapon, and also the picture of the woman with the sketchbook who could sort of lower it and blend in. So I thought those were impressive illustrations. Fields like this are always agonizing over representations of reality versus reality. To me, it's just, all communication is symbolic. So we're representing whatever it is, it's all a representation. And in this case, you're looking at something that is representative in a different moment. So it reminded me of some documentaries that I have seen, and I was really ambivalent about this, but that are actually animated or that use animation. So Waltz with Bashir is one that was, I think, about the Intifada in the 70s, where Israeli soldiers backed off and let and I don't know whether it let a massacre take place. And an Israeli soldier had been on the scene and had nightmares about this, and it had been recorded, and they used his words, but the entire piece until the last 40 seconds is animated, including how he had these nightmares, and they show these horrible Doberman pinschers with sort of dripping fangs to create the kind of fear, and illustrating things over and over because they didn't have footage, and also because it didn't need to be a one-for-one sort of representation. Now, at the end, they show 40 seconds of real footage, and that kind of lends some credibility to the whole piece, that, okay, this really did happen. It's not without controversy, but it was an example of using animation where you didn't have any other choice, and that it became effective. Another was, and I'm not sure the title, I'm not sure if it's Audrey and Daisy or a different one about sexual assault, but there had been interviews with people that were either participants in a sexual assault or depositions, or who were affected by sexual assault. And in order to protect them, the producers created animation using their words so that the words were an accurate depiction of what was said. And they used actors as well, so they had voices that spoke on behalf of the children, and they used facial expressions that represented what they had seen, but it was a way to create an anonymity so that people could speak to this particular issue. And it seems like that's exactly what you're getting at, this idea of the sketch not being literal, the sketch not being a weapon, the sketch also not being, or the graphic part of it not being, not fingering somebody or outing somebody that's been affected by sexual assault or something like that. So there are some films that have used animation techniques that seem to go quite nicely with the point that you're trying to make. And, I mean, I can send you those if you're interested, and I can send you the links to it, or at least the title. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah?
Oh, I was just going to mention to Kevin a couple of things. One, Hunter S. Thompson, pre-Gonzo, where does he fit? The Hell's Angels book. It's almost all straight up reporting, hardcore reporting. I mean, he is he does become his own character, and he kind of pushes himself into scenes, but still, it's not full-fledged Gonzo yet, so he's not really quite in either camp. That's one thing to think about. The other thing is, you put the Unwinding in there, Packer. That book is different to me because it's almost like using a Burroughsian cut-up method. Like he's got chapters, recurring subjects that like 5 or 6 characters that he chips away at. He kind of has one narrative, but he chops it up into pieces and puts it through about 5 times in the book. So he's got about 3 or 4 or 5 characters like that. He's got cities like Tampa, and he's got Silicon Valley. They're like recurring characters that come and go. He's got these weird bumper chapters that have ellipses with different fonts and different point sizes that just kind of give flashes of what was going on at any given year. And then he's got, what is this other thing? I think that might be it, but it's all kind of like this weird teleological exercise. It's not just reporting, although there's a fearsome amount of reporting in it. Sure. So like, I think he's kind of gone beyond just like literally that kind of big book format. He's not like Michener or something like, like just fearsomely reporting, and he's doing something else.
Augusto, in your slideshow, you had a picture of the, very, very quickly, of the raft of the Medusa by Jericho.
Which?
You had a photograph of a painting, the raft of the Medusa by Jericho.
Okay, you do want to... okay, I can explain shortly.
And as I recall, there were people standing in front of the painting. It's a very large painting in the Louvre, if I'm not mistaken.
This is to explain the idea why it's important to research objects. And then I quote Bruno, and he had an exhibit in the Set Paim in Karlsruhe, some museum there, and it's not about the picture actually. His idea is that the frame, his thesis is that painting has contributed to construct this artificial distinction between subjective inner and subjective observer and an objective object.
Beautiful.
And his idea that the frame of the painting is helping to do it.
Okay, I just sent you your email address a photograph from 2 years ago in the New York Times of some desperate immigrants landing on the island of Lesbos, and the painting, once you see it, once you click on it, I guess sent you the whole link, is almost, you can't look at it and not be reminded very specifically of the Guerrico painting. So this might add to your slide set. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
You'll see it when you do your email.
Thank you.
One more if we have time. Yeah. So for Kevin, there's a book out there on the publication and reception of Silent Spring, which is one of the obviously big books of the 20th century. And the University of Massachusetts Press probably came out about 5-10 years ago or something. But it's how a single book provoked a major public controversy, and it gets into the editorial history. I would suggest that the book provides a really great methodology for dealing with this, which is exactly what I've been trying to deal with in a History of the Iowa Writers Workshop, trying to look at the most seminal productions out of that creative writing program, and then couch it in terms of its cultural context. But also by looking at the mechanism of fame that those editorial coordinates represent, and really to break down this myth of the writer, or in this case journalist, as an isolated, alienated artist, but someone who is operating in a complex system of alliances that are academic, or in this case cultural, they're political, and they're aesthetic. And the more you can tease out and clarify what those alliances are, I think the more you're going to really understand then what the big book does and is.
One of the things that informed this a little bit is another project I'm working on with a co-author, which is outside of my usual realm of expertise. We're doing a very contemporary issue in the mass resignations from the New Republic 8 or so years ago. And we're interviewing all of the editors and contributing editors, because we're trying to sort of figure out what makes that alliance of reporters. What did it mean to be the New Republic, and what did it mean to be one of the reporters or contributing editors who was a part of the identity of the New Republic at the time? And then what's left after almost literally everybody leaves? I mean, is it still, it's like the ship of Theseus, right? I mean, if you replace all the boards, is it still the New Republic? And so those are some of the questions we're trying to get at, which I think is a little bit about that network of journalists, because I know journalists know who is an Atlantic person and who is a New Yorker person and who's writing for Slate, but also does some things for the Times Magazine, and what those alliances mean and how they define the identity of those journalists as well as the publications.
Yeah, and then it's going to color the subject, the style, and then the pitch, and the notion of audience that they're really trying to reach, and the splash that they want to make. Is it highbrow? Is it middle brow? Is it middle lowish brow? That has much more to do with all of those issues than just simply the impress. The press that's putting it out, the publisher. So it's great.
Yes. Other questions? Maybe just one question from Augusto. What particular challenges do you have when you're dealing with such a multicultural context? Because in your campus you have books in German, in French, in Portuguese. And so I was wondering about the particular challenges, because you have probably different traditions as well. So is there anything to say?
It's not only that, the problem is the comics is a multimedia language. And I can study it from the point of view of journalism, I can study it from the point of view of visual studies, or history, and sometimes it's difficult. I just try to write like essays so I can put these things together. And I try to use the original language of these books, but sometimes it's not possible.
And you have translations for most of them?
I don't know, in German it's not necessary to translate everything. Like English, I like that, and French too.
Okay, well, thank you for your very generous comments. It was a great conversation.